Probably should have worn this shirt last week. Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be discussing the story of the Radium Girls. It is horrifying. It is tragic. Before I started my research, I had heard of the Radium Girls in the past, but I didn't look very deep. After researching this, I'm shocked and horrified, and it's so tragic. The things that those poor women went through. I am going to give a warning because I will be discussing some of the medical issues that the women faced, and they're pretty gruesome. I won't be using any photographs because I feel like that's not right. I don't feel comfortable using those. If you guys would like to look them up, that's perfectly fine, but I think that the description of the injuries themselves are enough. Some of it's going to be kind of rough and graphic. I'm going to start off by giving some background for this whole situation. Radium was discovered in the form of radium chloride by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898. They discovered it while removing uranium from uraninite and found that the remaining material was still radioactive. They also won a Nobel Peace Prize for this discovery, making Marie Curie the first female recipient of the award. Now, after its discovery, William Joseph Hammer, who happened to be an assistant to Thomas Edison, he was the first to suggest that radium salts were useful in the treatment of cancer and tumors. With the help of Dr. Willie Meyer, they observed that radium salts were effective in treating and shrinking tumors, although that they did not cure them completely. After this, people went wild with radium. Radium began being incorporated into everything, from drinking water to condoms. What? Spas began infusing their pools with radium. Radium was in toothpaste. And many beauty companies began incorporating radium into their beauty products and saying that it was like a fountain of youth. So use this radium lipstick, use this radium face cream. I mean, it was in everything. Forgive me because I'm probably about to just destroy this name. Dr. Sabin A. von Sochaki. I'm just going to call him Dr. Sabin. But Dr. Sabin invented a radioluminescent paint in 1908. It especially became popular when World War I broke out, and it was used on watch faces and gave soldiers the ability to see what time it was without giving away their position in battle. But the radioluminescent paint was also used on aircraft instruments. So it had like a wide variety of uses. Previously known as the Radium Luminous Material Corporation, the U.S. Radium Corporation, founded by Dr. Sabin and based in Orange, New Jersey, began marketing Undark, which is the type of radioluminescent paint that they used. Radium Dial Company, which is another radioluminescent product manufacturer, opened its doors in 1920, and they were also based in Ottawa, Illinois. During the period of World War I and the Great Depression, women were the people fighting, and they're fighting in the workplace, just give me money. Women were the main ones who were taking up most of the jobs since a lot of the men were off fighting in battle. Women were the ones who took the jobs painting the radium paint onto the watch dial faces. And they were taught to do this in a particular manner. They used camel hair brushes, I believe. They were very small, like this, for instance. And they were taught the lip dip technique. And that's where you put the brush in your mouth, twirl between your lips, dip it into the paint, and paint. And then once the point wasn't as fine anymore, then they were taught to do that process again. And each time they did this, they were ingesting small amounts of radium. They taught the women this technique because radium was seen as a valuable resource. It was going for approximately about $2 million a gram in today's standards. They didn't want to waste any of it. They didn't know it, but a lot of the men in the factory that were working with it had protective gear. They wore lead aprons, they wore masks, and they only touched the radium with tongs. The women were told that the radium was safe for them to work with multiple times by their management. Scientists of that time were already beginning to backtrack on the safeness of radium. The women were given nothing to protect themselves. Now imagine doing that for 8 hours a day. Because, I mean, you can't get very far with a brush like this with paint on it. It's gonna lose its fine tip at some point. So they were gonna have to do that over and over after just a few strokes. The women working in the factory discovered that after working with the radium all day, they would glow. Some of them even began to paint their fingernails and their teeth with it. I think it was in like a trailer or a clip from the Radium City documentary. She said that they would like paint their ears with it, paint on their faces like mustaches, and they thought that it was completely harmless, which is, God, it's so bad. Some women even wore their evening wear to work if they had an event after their shift, so that way they would have a glowing look about them for their evening business. But while radium in small amounts was not that bad, these women were ingesting it multiple times all day long. Radium is similar to calcium once it enters the body. It becomes absorbed by the bones and it begins to eat away at your bone tissue. Molly Maggia, a worker at the U.S. Radium Corporation, visited the dentist with complaints of tooth pain and loose teeth. The dentist removed one tooth, but then the next one began to hurt and loosen, and then the next one after that. Instead of it being like a routine procedure, the extraction sites wouldn't heal and they would become very, very infected. They would start to develop ulcers that would begin to leak blood and pus. Her joints then began to ache, but her doctor didn't really understand what was happening to her. He ended up just sending her away with basically a bottle of aspirin, and that was it, because he assumed it was rheumatism. There was nothing else that he could really do. He was kind of clueless. By May of 1922, Molly had lost almost all of her teeth. At one appointment, whenever her dentist went to touch her jaw, it crumbled. He was able to basically lift her jaw out of her mouth. God, it's awful. But after the removal of her jaw, the radium eventually ate through her arteries and she basically choked to death on her own blood. And she died at age 24 that September. And the worst part is, that's just the first one. Grace Fryer, a co-worker of Molly, began experiencing similar issues, as did many other women. After having an x-ray done, her doctor noted that her jawbone was basically just filled with holes. Many of their former coworkers began experiencing their symptoms, and the only link between them was the fact that they all worked as dial painters. Grace saw Dr. Frederick Flynn and his assistant for her issues, but they said that they found nothing wrong with her and that she was perfectly healthy. Y'all, this story makes me mad. Not only was Dr. Frederick Flynn not a licensed doctor, he was a toxicologist. And get this, he also worked for the U.S. Radium Corporation. His assistant was the vice president of the company. As more women began to show symptoms and it was being reported to their doctors, eventually the media began to pick up on it. The U.S. Radium Corporation hired Cecil Drinker. I'm not sure if it's Cecil or Cecil. Cecil sounds fancier for some reason. Who was a physiologist from Harvard, to try to get him to write a report on his findings to quell the gossip. He found that there was radium powder all over the place, even in the chairs that were not used by the women during their work hours. This is a quote from Drinker's reports. Dust samples collected in the workroom from various locations and from chairs not used by the workers were luminous in the darkroom. Their hair, faces, hands, arms, necks, the dresses, the underclothes, even the corsets of the dial painters were luminous. One of the girls showed luminous spots on her legs and thighs. The back of another was luminous almost to the waist. Now, US Radium was completely outraged by this report. They threatened to sue him, and unbeknownst to him, they took his report, totally changed it. They published completely different findings, but made sure to leave his name as the author. The U.S. Radium Corporation began pushing the narrative not only to throw the media off, but to also discredit the women by saying that there's no way that their symptoms can all be related. It's such a large spectrum. Maybe they have syphilis. They tried to blame all of this stuff that was happening to them on syphilis. Syphilis! I know I've already said that, but like it really makes me mad the way these women were treated. So not only were these girls experiencing some severe health issues, they were also having their reputations just destroyed. Talk about adding insult to injury. In 1925, a doctor by the name of Harrison Martland discovered that the radium was settling in the women's bones. And even just a minute amount of radium, once it's ingested into the human body, it has devastating effects. He found that the radium made the bones become honeycombed. Grace ended up in a back brace because her spine had essentially just become crushed and like collapsed in on itself, so she couldn't really walk without assistance, and she couldn't really even sit up without that back brace. So sad. Many of the women didn't even know that they had radium poisoning, like until they happened to get up in the middle of the night and they were able to see themselves in the mirror. And because of this happening, they were given the nickname Ghost Girls. And during the trial, which we'll get into that, they were also referred to as the Society of the Living Dead. Grace began searching for a lawyer at this point because she felt that somebody needed to be held accountable for what happened to them. But nobody was really that interested in taking the case due to the Radium Corporation being so big. You know, the Radium Corporation also had some of these people under their spell. You know, they were involved with the company in some way, shape, or form. Wow, that is intense. And it's like camping. 'Cause it's intense. Get it? Love me. Oh shit, did they glow green? Insensitivity. I apologize. I actually really like that because it looks like it's glowing. Damn it. Okay, time for wing liner. But eventually, she found someone who is willing to take on the case, which involved 4 other women who had worked with Grace and Molly at the factory. The 4 other women, their names were Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, I may be mispronouncing that, and if I am, I apologize, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Larice. The 5 women were represented by a man of the name Raymond Berry. Wow, y'all. You see that? I knew as soon as I touched that brush on my face, that was all bad. The women were having a hard time due to the statute of limitations on occupational illnesses being 2 years. And radium poisoning didn't usually show up for quite a few years, like up to 5. It took its time, slowly eating away the women's bones before they started showing symptoms. And then, of course, as time went on, it started to escalate and they began to deteriorate rapidly. At one point during the proceedings, Grace stated, quote, "It is not for myself I care. I am thinking more of the hundreds of girls to whom this may serve as an example." Excuse you. But by the time that a lot of the Radium Girls had their day in court, whether it be in the Illinois suit or the Jersey suit, a lot of them were unable to even stand and take the oath. They were so sick. For example, one of the Illinois women, I think her name was Catherine Wolfe Donahue, she heard testimony from the doctor. He said that he did not feel comfortable explaining the reality of their situation to them whenever he was asked if it was permanent and fatal. It's said that Catherine Wolfe Donahue, she basically just collapsed into tears and had to be taken out of the courtroom. A lot of them ended up giving testimony in both cases basically on their deathbed. But by the time the case got to trial, they kept trying to adjourn it or prolong it. I mean, the reasons were just ridiculous. They were told that a lot of their witnesses were going on a vacation and they wouldn't be back for up to, I think one case was delayed by like 15 months or something like that. But the women had only been given approximately 4 to 6 months to live. They kept trying to drag out the proceedings. It was ridiculous. A columnist by the name of Walter Lippmann said, and I quote, "One of the most damnable travesties of justice that has ever come to our attention. It is an outrage that the company should attempt to keep these women from suing. There is no possible excuse for such a delay." He goes on to say, "The women are dying. If ever a case called for prompt adjudication, it is the case of 5 crippled women who are fighting for a few miserable dollars to ease their last days on earth." Due to the public outcry, they shortened the delay to just a couple of months. Marie Curie, whenever she heard about the situation, she said, quote, "I would be only too happy to give any aid that I could, but there is absolutely no means of destroying the substance once it enters the human body." But because the court proceedings were constantly being delayed, the New Jersey Radium Girls were forced to settle out of court. They had only been given about 4 months left to live, which is so sad. All of them were so young. It's just sick. But even though that they decided to take the settlement instead of prolonging their pain and agony, honestly, this led to many other cases being filed against radium corporations throughout the country. The Illinois-based Radium Dial had women file suit there, led by Catherine Wolfe Donahue. She's quoted as saying at one point, "There were meetings at our plant that bordered on riots. The chill of fear was so depressing we could scarcely work." She ended up giving testimony from her deathbed at their trial. But Radium Dial ended up even taking out an ad in a newspaper saying that if any of their workers were displaying signs of radium poisoning, they would have stopped all operations immediately. Which, yeah, okay, sure. But Radium Dial began to act like how the U.S. Radium Corporation did to the women in New Jersey. Companies actually went so far to the point they were so desperate to try to prevent any of the issues that happened with the U.S. Radium Corporation from happening that they went as far as interfering with the girls' autopsies. Like, they even started stealing their bones. But Catherine Wolfe Donahue, she ended up developing a huge tumor on her hip. She also lost her teeth and had to keep a handkerchief nearby to help wipe the blood and the pus that was coming from her mouth. Since this was during the period of the Great Depression, instead of being supported by a lot of the locals, the women tended to be shunned due to all of this. They tended to be shunned because it was a good paying job. They got, I think, 1 cent per dial that they finished, and it was one of the only jobs that were available at the time, and people thought that they should just be grateful, and it was just horrible the way that they were treated. Catherine and her friends were represented by Leonard Grossman, who happened to take on the case pro bono. Now, this case was different than the New Jersey case in the sense that the women ended up winning their case. And even though Radium Dial began appealing and appealing and appealing, even going all the way up to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court ended up ruling in favor of the women. I forgot to mention this earlier, but during the trial, in order to try to prove what was happening to them was really happening, they exhumed one of the bodies of a deceased Radium girl, and they found that her bones glowed. She was so radioactive that her bones were basically just glowing in the casket. There was a dentist who had kept the jawbone of a Radium girl in his desk, I believe is the case. And it was next to some x-ray film or like some dental film or something. Her jawbone was in there with that film for a while. And whenever he opened it later, he discovered that there were spots on the x-ray film or like dental film, proving that it was exposed to radioactivity. Even though the Radium Girls didn't live long, not all of them led to see justice. Not all of them were even able to collect much on their payments. Their settlements were, I can't remember exactly for which group of Radium Girls this was, but one group was granted, I think, $10,000 plus $600 every year for the rest of their lives. But I mean, really, what is the value of a life? These women all died so young, and it's kind of difficult to find a positive takeaway from this. But because the Radium Girls made sure to hold the companies accountable, we have them to thank for OSHA today. It also introduced a whole bunch of new regulations, and the case ended up setting the precedent that companies were going to be held responsible for the safety of their workers and hazardous conditions. And working with hazardous materials, they had to be handled better. They had to be given more protection. Almost immediately after these cases, the companies who were producing these things with radium overhauled their protections for their workers. So even though the story of the Radium Girls is so tragic and so horrific, honestly, it's horrific. I mean, Maggia died at the age of 24. It's so sad. But by exposing the company's wrongdoing, we have them to thank for so many different things. About 14,000 workers would die on the job every year before OSHA, and now it's just around 4,000, I believe. But their contribution to workplace safety, hazardous material safety, and their contribution to science and the legacy of what they've been through, it's incredible. It should be remembered. It's an awful story. It's a sad story, but I feel like it definitely should be talked about. If you didn't know, radium has a half-life of about 1,600 years. So the women will be glowing in their graves for quite some time. It's been said that if you take a Geiger meter, I think it's what it's called, if you take a Geiger meter and hold it over the graves of the women, that it will move. It will detect it. A few of them had to be disinterred and reburied in lead coffins. The story of the Radium Girls is devastating. It is horrific, but they left a legacy behind that should not be ignored. And you know what they say, if we don't acknowledge our history, we are doomed to repeat it. All right, I think that is going to be it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed the story of the Radium Girls. And if you liked the video, make sure to leave a like. And if you'd like to also subscribe, that would be cool. I like people, so I'm kind of weird, but you'll get used to me after a while. It's not that bad, I swear. Yeah, I'll see you next time.